Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my August wrap-up. There are a few books that I won't be mentioning in this video and that's just because I don't fancy it. So the first one is At Bertram's Hotel by Agatha Christie, and I'm not mentioning this because it was a reread and I've talked about how my opinion of this has changed since I previously read it in my reread tag, so I'll leave a link to that in the description. Then another book I read for the Booktube prize and therefore won't be talking about it now until the results of this round are announced is 10 minutes 38 seconds in This Strange World by Elif Shafak. And finally, another reread for me, also for the Booktube prize, is Women Talking by Miriam Toews, which leaves me with just 5 books to talk about. The first book is 10. This is a poetry collection put together by Bernardine, Evaristo and Daljit Nagra in 2010, and this is 10 Black and other ethnic minority authors. This anthology was released at a time when a lot of Black and other minority writers weren't being published as much in the UK. I'm not sure what the percentage is now, but this book was released in 2010 and features 10 new poets who hadn't yet made it onto the scene, or if they had, their forthcoming collections hadn't yet been released, and that's why they were included in this anthology. And each poet is introduced by a already established poet of the time. It was the introductions in this book that irked me somewhat because I didn't feel like they were necessary. I understand that the poets who were introducing the work were... I'm going to apologise for whatever my neighbour's doing out there. I did check and apparently it's illegal to murder your neighbours. I understand that the poets introducing the other poets were their mentors and thus they had more of a connection to the work and had perhaps helped coach them through it and how to improve their work. But I also felt as though that was trying to tell you how you as a reader should understand and interpret the poems, so I didn't much care for the introductions to each new poet. However, this did what a good anthology is supposed to do in that it introduced me to a lot of new poets who I would be keen on exploring in future. This book was very kindly sent to me by Charlie Brooks, so thank you, Charlie, for what has ultimately become one of a few poetry anthologies that I actually enjoyed and would like to revisit in future. You really picked out quite the good gift for me. Next, I read Hotel du Lac by Anita Brookner, and this was inspired by Sarah of Hardcover Hearts and Leo of A Little Book Life, who have both been reading Anita Brookner and are planning on reading her entire works. Hotel du Lac is a book that I have meant to read for years because it is something that has always been mentioned to me. When I first started learning about the Booker Prize, this was a book that came up often, and people talk about the time that it won. Yet I knew nothing about it. I am quite thrilled to have finally read this book. Edith Hope is a romantic novelist who is staying at the Hotel du Lac after some sort of social exile from her home. I can understand why this has been such a memorable read for people over the last near 30 years, because, if not more than 30 years, isn't it? It is. For the last 36 years, I can understand why this has entranced readers. I chose to read this book because it is following a novelist, and I thought that this kinship of being writers, although this person's traditionally published, would be a great starting point for me to read Anita Brookner. It also helps that when people think of this writer, this seems to be the book that they think about. There's this question throughout over what she's done that could possibly be so terrible as to end up at the Hotel du Lac. And it's one of the reasons I ended up going and reading at Bertram's Hotel afterwards, because I like these stories where you take a cast of characters who have never met before and you place them in a hotel setting which becomes this microcosm. And here you have a certain type, a certain set of people who are all turning up at this hotel. And Edith, you get the feeling that she's exiled socially, but this comes from not being what people expect her to be. So again, empathetic towards that. I'll admit towards the end, I was incredibly fearful as to where this book would go, because the thing that happened to Edith in the past, I understood. There was something in that that reminded me of a family story. The author is able to write with a certain subtlety that adds to this dramatic irony, and as the reader you're able to pick up on, and there's this tension there, even though there's nothing extremely horrible happening. There's something beneath the surface that left me feeling tense anyway. I felt like this book was going down a certain line, especially with the main character being a romantic novelist. I thought this is where it's going to go, and I was terrified that this would be the way Brookner was taking the story, and if it had gone that way, I would not be giving this book a favourable review. But I think that Brookner there is perhaps playing with the reader and saying for us to change our expectations of what happens in literature, even in 1984, and saying to trust the writer because they know what's best for their characters, even if it's not necessarily the story we expect. And this was written in a way that everything ended up feeling right, and it's a book with undercurrents that I look forward to going back and exploring, because I don't think that you get everything upon the first read, and I really like that about a book, especially when it's so short, it's concise, but it is written in a very beautiful fashion. Next, I read A Wreath of Roses by Elizabeth Taylor. When Sarah and Leah were talking about Anita Brookner and the manner in which she writes, I was reminded of Mrs Palfrey at the Claremont, which was the first Elizabeth Taylor book I read a few years ago. I love that book. It made it onto my favourites of 2015, and it's something I think of fondly, yet I have never explored the author further. Being reminded of her, I chose to just go and purchase one of her books off Waterstone's website, and this happened to be the first one on there. This book comes from a time in Elizabeth Taylor's career when she started writing about artistic folk. Camilla has always gone on this annual holiday with her friends, Liz and Frances, and this year something has changed. Liz has got her baby and she's looking after the baby, and so her attentions are elsewhere, and Frances is an artist who is now struggling with growing older and the infirmities that come with that, making it more difficult to create her art. Camilla is at something of the crossroads in her life, and then comes onto the scene Richard Elton, a man who you can tell from the beginning is a bit of a bad-un, but despite other people being able to recognise that, Camilla does not, because Camilla is feeling a disconnect between herself and her friends. This is a book that I read slowly because the prose, as I mentioned in a wool gathering video, is absolutely unctuous. Similar to Anita Brookner, Elizabeth Taylor writes with subtlety, but she writes some brilliant passages of description, and it is an incredibly vivid book. It explores the changing relationships of these three women, and also explores how societal obligations can make people feel a certain type of way. This book is set after World War II, and these women are having to acclimatise to having lost the roles that they had during the Second World War, in which they were doing jobs that had been previously attributed to men, and they don't want to go back to being the women they were before, which was somewhat cowed, it seems. Camilla, you have the sense, goes against the social norms. She wants to speak out and she wants to be able to live her own life, whereas her friend Liz is riddled with these anxieties that come from having her first child, and she has always been similar to Camilla in that she has led this life where she's been exuberant, but now she's married to a vicar and she's wondering how she can possibly be the type of woman he wants her to be, and yet also try and keep hold of herself. And you have the older lady, Frances, who is observing all of this and knowing what's best for these girls, knowing the way that the world works, but also coming to terms with the fact that she might have lost any influence she has now that they see her more as a friend than a guardian. This book really cemented Elizabeth Taylor as a writer whose works I think I'm going to continue to enjoy. I think she could become one of my favourite writers, and this is from the style in which she writes. It felt almost like reading an Agatha Christie without the detective or the murder. I think that the author managed to capture a place and time extremely well, as also capturing the insecurities that people felt after the Second World War as they tried to get back to how the world was. She captured this sense of the sweltering heat of summer and the dark parts of our humanity going into the psychology of her characters, and this felt very much like various character studies, pulling apart the characters and allowing the reader to do that, to get this better sense of how their minds works, but also it gave the reader the opportunity to think about how certain people might make decisions based on the point that they are in their life, whereas they might not have made that decision before. The first meeting with Camilla and Richard is brilliantly done. And then to take it towards the end, towards the more climactic point of the book, to see how it all rounds itself out and becomes something cyclical, was brilliant to read. I liked the conversations that were had here and how Taylor managed to capture this story. On the blurb of this book, it calls A Wreath of Roses Taylor's darkest novel, and I can certainly see where that perception comes from. Indeed, that's what made me read it somewhat slower, so I could take my time over it and see what was properly being said between the lines. It's somewhat like Tess of the D'Urbervilles, in that it might be telling a rather dark tale, but the language used is incredibly beautiful and, as I said before, unctuous. That's the only word I could think of whilst reading this book. And I look forward to reading more of Elizabeth Taylor in future and might have already purchased another 2 of her books. Next, I read The Thirst by Jo Nesbo, and this one was translated by a new translator, and that person is Neil Smith. I don't know which book in the Harry Hole series this is. It's set a few years after the previous book, and Harry Hole is now a lecturer at a college, at the police college, and Katrine Bart has taken over his job. A murder happens at the start of this where a woman's throat is torn out by someone who is wearing iron teeth. This begins this story of possible vampirism going on throughout wherever this is. Norway? Is it Norway? It's Norwegian noir anyway. I believed that this was going to be a return to form. It's been over a year since I read a Harry Hole book, and the reason for that is that the last 2 I'd read, I noticed the formula. The difference in this one is that throughout they know who the murderer is and the reader is aware of who the murderer is. They just are trying to catch them. Unfortunately, there is a final part of this book that is completely unnecessary. It's extremely long, it's extremely bloated, and at times I was thinking that the reason for this is because fans of the series will really enjoy getting to see all of the characters they have come to like getting more of a role within this book. However, they don't actually do anything to solve the crime in the end. They are just there, and they don't further the story, but they exist to create something like the soap opera narrative, and that's what I felt like reading this. Matthew of MCS Books talked about a book recently being a bit masculine, and this definitely felt like a masculine read. This isn't the first time that I've noticed some rather bad attitudes towards women, and I don't know whether that comes from the author, whether it comes from the translation, but it just seemed horrible to women. This book was released in 2017, and yet the attitude towards women makes it feel as though it was written in the 70s or the 80s. They're often thought of as sex objects. They have no character outside of that. Raquel, Harry's now wife, spends most of the book in a coma and is indeed only there to give Harry a reason to go back to alcoholism. And I'm getting fed up of that as well in these books, is that Harry will no longer be drinking. He will be off, he'll be on the wagon, and then something will happen and he'll decide to start drinking again. And I thought we'd passed that in this book, because the first time it happens, he goes to the bar and the owner throws him out, saying that he doesn't want to do this. Yet then, for some reason, Harry still ends up getting drunk at some point. And it's just, I think that Jo Nesbo has fallen into this trap of thinking his readers are going to expects certain type of things, so he's created this almost paint by numbers style of crafting a thriller. Yes, it's an incredibly fast read, but as I say, it's bloated, it's too long, and there are elements that were certainly unnecessary, and I think were only used to create some extra drama that wasn't needed, but was just there as a nice nod to the readers who followed the series for a long time. As with all Joe Nesbo books, this will be going back to the charity shop. I'm just disappointed because I think that this is a series that when I first started reading it, it started out strong. It just seems to be getting weaker and, as I say, more masochistic and with rather poor attitudes towards women and certain ethnic minorities. I've heard that his books that are no longer to do with Harry Hole, The Sun and Macbeth, are much better than this, and I'd be interested to read those. I do have the other Harry Hole books here to read, and I might do that if I'm looking for something quick to read, but I hope that maybe attitudes have changed somewhat in the story, because this is supposed to be set in 2017, and it was difficult to figure out why the author wrote things this, the way that he did. And finally, I read Balman and Black by Diane Setterfield. I read this in one day last week. This book captured my attention so well that I ended up pushing all of my other plans aside, taking this downstairs, sitting in a corner and just reading it straight through, cover to cover. I don't understand why this book captured my attention so much, because I don't think that I don't get it. So in the prelude to this story, William Bellman kills a rook with a catapult and he's surrounded by these other boys. Then throughout the story he is being haunted by rooks and this man in black. The first part of this book sees Bellman going through a lifetime of tragedies. His father was cast out by the family for marrying his mother because she was seen as socially beneath him, yet he manages to get a job with his uncle at the factory, and you get this sense that he's really looked out. Things are going incredibly well for Bellman. He begins to learn how to do everything at this mill and how to complete he puts his all into everything he does. And so he figures out how to take over the running of this factory to make sure that it's running better than it is. And then you have these tragedies, and I'll admit it was a strange book to be reading after a pandemic's just happened and a almost plague goes off throughout the village. I'm not sure whether it was scarlet fever or what it was. Bellman ends up having a lot of tragedies that cause him to decide that he is going to set up a first major shop for mourning wear. This is at the time when death became a thing that sold more. You were constantly having this period of mourning, how long you had to wear black for, when you switched to grey, what things were appropriate, and he was going to put all of that in one store. He was going to find a true black, and he's entered into this strange partnership. Throughout this entire book, I felt like I was reading the story of Ebenezer Scrooge before A Christmas Carol. It felt very much like, and I'm going to go and use a portion of A Christmas Carol where we get the ghost of Christmas past and Scrooge is looking back. And I felt like Bellman's tenacity for business that saw him almost losing sight of everyone else around him, his behaviour and his focus reminded me of Scrooge forgetting about everyone around him. And I'm not saying that Bellman is miserly, but he ends up living a certain type of lifestyle. There was this tension there. Again, I can't really say I understood. And this book is just about one half. Bellman is helping improve stuff at a factory, then tragedy strikes, and then the next half, he just spends it setting up this shop. And it shouldn't work. I should not like this book as much as I did. I should not have been as enthralled by the prose as I was. It made no sense to me. I don't understand why I liked it, but I did. I was talking to my sister and I was saying to her, it makes no sense. It makes no sense because it moves through his life so quickly. We don't really see much of anything about him. There are barely any questions answered, and yet there was beautiful prose, some blend of the supernatural that might have been supernatural but was really incredibly gothic, evocative storytelling, as it says here, atmospheric, and this makes it 3 for 3 of Diane Setterfield's books that I have read and I have enjoyed, and I am blaming Katie of Books and Things for that, because she introduced me to what the 13th tale was actually about. She did a read-along of this last year that I missed. I read Once Upon a River last year and really enjoyed that, and I don't understand. Maybe it's the links to classic fiction that Diane Setterfield includes in all of her work. Maybe it's the storytelling. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe I can tell that Diane Setterfield really appreciates storytelling, and that comes through in her writing. I was thrilled to read this. I think that it's the perfect autumnal read, and I could say that about any of Setterfield's books. It upsets me that I don't own any of her other books, because I either borrowed them or... No, well, I borrowed them, that's it, that's all I did. I borrowed the previous ones. This is just what I bought for this read-along that I never participated in. It's by no means my favourite of Setterfield's, but I've loved all of them, and they've all been books that have grabbed me, stolen my attention, and if anyone spoke to me whilst I was reading, I was liable to want to throw something at them because I didn't want to be interrupted. I was in the story. I feel like I was walking along the streets with Bellman when he was having these frenzied moments, wondering whether he had caught sight of Mr. Black. There is this thriller and mystery aspect that was in there that makes no sense, because it's just about business. And one of the things that I hate most in the world is flaming people trying to make, like, rich people doing rich people things, isn't it? And I suppose he's not really a rich person. Maybe this is somewhat like a rags to riches story. I don't know. I actually cannot understand why I like this book so much. But yeah, I do. I really, really like this one. And them's the books. If you've read any of these and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.